Hey everyone, thank you for joining the session. My name is Claire Feeney. Let me just share my screen here and we can get started. Awesome. So excited for us to go through our session today, talking a little bit about the impact that the privacy landscape and the current changes and shifts that we're seeing both in our technology ecosystem and with our customers and audience expectations, how that's really driving a big opportunity when it comes to making sure that we're balancing privacy and personalization to meet the expectations of our audience and ultimately win as marketers. My name is Claire Feeney. I'm the product marketing manager here at OneTrust Preference Choice, and I'm super passionate about the opportunity that marketers have, that brands have, when it comes to leveraging a privacy program, really to build trust with your audience and use it as a way to navigate the new sources of data that we need to become experts at, really, when we see a lot of our traditional, more third-party data sources fading away. And we'll talk a little bit about that in our session today. I've spent the last 10 years in enterprise software and working primarily with security and IT teams. So I love my job at OneTrust, getting to work with marketers, getting to leverage my marketing experience and really work with our customers on building transparent user experiences, focusing on audience trust, and of course, being compliant with all the privacy regulations that you need to for your sales and your marketing activities. So in today's session, we're going to go through a little bit on existing and upcoming legislation, what marketers should be aware of, a very brief look at the GDPR and the CCPA that's impacting us in the US as well. I want to go through a little bit of some of the changes we're seeing in the technology ecosystem with things like iOS 14, third-party cookies, as well as the shift in audience expectations, what our customers are asking for and expecting when it comes to both privacy and personalization, and how we can look to meet those expectations as marketers. Just to give you a little bit of background on OneTrust and what we're all about, we help our customers become more trusted organizations. So basically give them the tool set to operationalize not only their compliance with all of the global privacy regulations, laws, and frameworks that apply to their organization, to their customers, to the data that they have, but also a mechanism, which is especially important for marketers, to create that transparent user experience that's going to help you build trust with your audience. And I like to say you can't build trust in a silo. There's obviously the have-tos as when it comes to compliance with certain privacy regulations, but it has to be balanced with the needs of different stakeholders. So not only your privacy and your legal team, but also your marketing team, as well as your end users, your audience, your customers, is a really important stakeholder. So if you haven't seen this report on privacy and consent management from Cuppinger Cole, I encourage you to check this report out. It's a great look at meeting the needs of not only legal and privacy, but also marketing and end users as well. All right, let's jump into it and look at some existing and upcoming legislation. So we obviously have a growing compliance challenge, but really what this means for marketers is that we need to have a shift in the way that we approach compliance with different privacy laws. It really has to be baked into our DNA and all the processes we have when you think about campaign planning, collecting data about our audience, our target market. When we think about things like our email marketing campaigns, really the privacy regulations and the compliance factor that we have is no longer really an ad hoc, let's get ready for the GDPR or let's make sure we have everything in place for the CCPA. There's simply too many regulations and laws that are passed and live and enforceable today and that are pending in different legislations around the world. So it really has to be something that is intrinsic to your process and intrinsic to your planning, and not something that you look at on a project by project basis with your privacy or legal team. You really have to work together and go hand in hand. The biggest regulations and legislations that our customers ask us about are the GDPR and the CCPA. So I'll take you briefly through what marketers should be aware of when it comes to these regulations. So first, looking at the GDPR, this is in the EU and has 6 legal bases for processing we call personal data. So there's a differentiation between data and personal data in the GDPR. But when we think about personal data, it's really anything that can identify a person. So most of the information that we have as marketers can fall under personal data. And there's 6 legal bases for leveraging that data or processing that data that include consent, and we'll talk more about that. But if it's in compliance with a legal obligation, part of a contract, or in the best interests of either the individual or the public, these are legal bases that you could use as justification for leveraging data, for processing data in your organization. There's also the idea of legitimate interest. Now, for marketers, most of our activities are going to fall under legitimate interest. So the interests of either myself as a data controller, as a marketer that's leveraging that data, or as a third party to provide the best services, products to our audience. And there's also the concept of consent that's key for marketers as well. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about. We get a lot of questions about consent, and it's become one of the more common legal bases for processing data. And usually the decision for marketers is going to be between consent and legitimate interest when it comes to the legal bases you're using for processing any personal data. So to take a closer look at that decision for consent versus legitimate interest. So examples where you will need consent from your audience is looking at things like direct marketing. Anytime you're processing sensitive data, that's a special category of data, you'll need consent from the data subject, from your customer, your prospect, the audience member. And also important is when you're using any kind of ad targeting cookies or cookies that are going to be used to personalize ads, that also requires consent. When you're looking at things like personalizing the user experience, making sure that you are maybe processing employee data or researching new developments for a product or service within your organization, those can fall under legitimate interest. And legitimate interest should be the preferred legal basis where it's possible, because you won't have to get that opt-in from your audience. But only one legal basis can be used. Both are equally valid. So it's really up to you as a marketer and working with your privacy and legal teams to determine what legal basis applies in which situations. But it is preferable to use legitimate interest because there are several parameters for making sure you have valid consent from your audience. So if we think about things like ad targeting cookies, opting in or consenting to direct marketing, getting this in practice, you must meet these parameters. So first, it has to be, the consent given has to be separate from other terms and conditions. You can't just have this as a line item in a big agreement of terms and conditions or an end user agreement and have that be valid consent. You also have to make sure that it's an active opt-in. And by that, pre-ticked boxes that require you to untick if you want to opt out. Just scrolling on a page is not an active opt-in and would not be a valid consent. You also have to make sure that the options and the choices that you're giving your audience, your customers, your prospects is granular. So making sure that it's granular in that you are explaining the different types of processing you're doing to the different types of data that you're collecting. So again, keeping it unbundled, making sure you're being specific, making sure that your audience is informed with sufficient information about what they can expect when they share their data or give consent for their data to be leveraged for things like direct marketing or ad targeting. You can't have any imbalance of power. So if there's an imbalance of power between the data controller, the data processor, and the data subject or the individual, that's not a valid consent. And we'll look at an example of that in a second. And finally, this has to be easy to withdraw. So it has to be, they have to be informed about the right to withdraw their consent at any time. And if the consent is given with a checkbox, for example, it should be just as easy to withdraw consent as it was to give consent. So the biggest thing for marketers to keep in mind is that consent requires clear action. It has to be unmistakably interpreted that an audience member has given consent. So not acceptable, things like pre-ticked boxes, inactivity, silence, things that aren't a clear action are not acceptable for consent, for a valid consent, but things like ticking a box, choosing settings versus relying on what's default, or volunteering information, filling in a field marked as optional, providing that information voluntarily, indicates clear affirmative action and a valid consent. And again, just a reminder, in specific circumstances, consent would be required for things like automated decision-making, specific special categories of data, and things like that. So what does an invalid consent case look like? When we have employers that are requesting consent from their employees when it comes to things like monitoring information, that's not considered freely given. That should be under legitimate interests in the best interests of the data controller. If you drop your business card in a prize drawing box and that's later used for email marketing or phone call to that person, consent was given for the prize draw, but not really specific to marketing activities. So not really a consent there. The next example, I consent to direct marketing by mail, phone, and email. This isn't unbundled, so we need to be specific about the way that our audience, our customers are consenting to be contacted. So separating out email, phone, actual mail is important for getting valid consent. And finally, if you have to share, have to give consent in order to use a product or use a service, that's not considered freely given. And also it's important to make sure that we are naming any partners or vendors that might be controlling or processing this information for full visibility for our users. Now, when we look at the GDPR, there is a big emphasis for marketers, and what we're asked about most at OneTrust is what the impact is of getting those consents, making sure that you have valid consent so that you aren't losing access to your database, to any leads generated, or your customer base because of any kind of invalid consents. If you go through an audit or working with your legal team, you want to make sure all of that's buttoned up so that you are capturing leads, capturing data, getting that consent appropriately. On the flip side of that, what our customers are often looking at is comparing the GDPR and the CCPA and newly passed CPRA that are out of California in the States. The state of Virginia has adopted something similar very recently as well. And there are a lot of states that are looking at privacy regulation, as well as, of course, talk about a federal legislation that would impact the whole United States. But for now, most of our customers are looking at the GDPR and the CCPA, comparing, contrasting, and using that to set their strategy for a privacy program based on where their customer base is, where they do business. So by comparison, the CCPA went into effect in January of 2020. And recently, California, in part of the November elections, passed the CPRA, so the California Privacy Rights Act, that is made several amendments to the CCPA, including new consumer rights, a newly set up state privacy authority, and some more specific details and requirements relating to children's or minors' data. And there's some new definitions that have made it a little bit more clear for marketers, including a new definition of consent under the GDPR. But what really marketers need to know is that while we look at, I always tell marketers to think about the GDPR is requiring an opt-in or consent in many cases. The CCPA really looks at consumer rights and putting the power back in consumers' hands about the information companies have and how it's used, and the rights that they have to the right to things like right to disclosure. So what type of information a company or an organization has about me, the right to deletion, so the right to request a business delete all of the information that they have about me as a consumer, the right to opt out. In the GDPR, we think of the right to opt out as any kind of where processing and consent is used as a legal basis. For CCPA, it's really specific to the opting out of downstream sale or sharing of personal information. So sharing with vendors, sharing and making money off of selling data potentially. And that there's more specifics around that in the CPRA. And finally, the right to non-discrimination. So making sure that you're not denied goods or services if you exercise any of these privacy rights, like the right to disclosure, the right to deletion, the right to opt out. So looking at what the core differences are between the GDPR and the CCPA, and now the CPRA, or some call it CCPA 2.0. So the GDPR really has restrictions on how and why businesses can process personal data. They've defined special protection for different categories of data, like sensitive personal data. There has to be privacy kind of baked in, privacy by default. You have to opt in or give consent for specific things. The CCPA specifies that data is personal information can include things about a household, about devices owned by an individual. The CCPA also has the right to opt out, but it really only covers the sale or sharing of personal information. This is much narrower than GDPR's right to object or any kind of access rights. Consumer rights that are given under the GDPR. But the CCPA has access to, the access rights are broader. There are fewer exceptions that can be made. So under the GDPR, there can be things where an organization can refuse if it adversely affects any privacy rights of a third party. So the CCPA does not include those exceptions. So I share all of this and these more granular specific things about the differences and similarities between the GDPR and the CCPA, really to drive home the point that there are laws coming out, all of them have intricacies and differences in even just terminology between maybe what you call a consumer or a data subject, what you define as consent under that regulation, where consent comes into play, where you use opt-in, opt-out, or withdrawal. So all of the laws that we're seeing is basically in response to consumers feeling distrustful of corporations, how their information is being used, and the lack of transparency in how their data is used today. But really the biggest thing for marketers to take away is that there are a lot of privacy regulations, and we're seeing more and more of privacy regulations come online. So having a privacy first approach, really understanding your privacy program within your organization, not only to protect your KPIs, like not losing access to your customer base or your data because of noncompliance with the GDPR, but also understanding what the impact is to your data sources is important as well. So just understanding these regulations as a way and how they impact your day-to-day, but also understanding these as these privacy regulations and really what's changing in our ecosystem. Leverage that to, I think there's a huge opportunity to leverage that into the messaging and brand promises that you make your customers and your prospects so that they trust you as a brand and are more willing to share that personal data, what we call first-party data, with you. That's probably the most valuable thing you can get as a marketer. So I want to take a little bit of a closer look at some of the changes in the technology ecosystem that we're seeing, some of the things that we talk with our customers about on a day-to-day basis and help them plan for these shifts and these changes. The first thing is not really a surprise to anybody, but the move to mobile and using mobile apps is a huge strategy for especially our B2C customers and our publisher customers. And there's obviously a huge number of and big jump in the number of apps downloaded looking at iOS. So what Apple has done recently and what they announced at WWDC recently is that iOS 14, the ability to accurately kind of target and measure your campaigns will be impacted. So all app developers now will need to detail the privacy information of their apps in what they're calling a nutrition label. And you may have seen this on if you have an iPhone and recently been updated, you may have been asked about location tracking, tracking between apps. So basically, this app here, you can see on the right, how about would like permission to track you across apps and websites owned by other companies. This allows data. This data allows this app to deliver personalized ads to you, but you have to either allow tracking or ask this particular app not to track. And it's way they're giving more control and transparency to their users, to their audience, but obviously a huge impact to any brands that have an application or use tracking today to inform and personalize ads for their users. So we see that going away, which obviously impacts a data source for marketers in a way that we personalize the experience today. And we also, of course, have third-party cookies that are going away. So Safari, Firefox have eliminated third-party cookies by default. Chrome has committed to doing this by 2022. So within the next year, that's obviously the biggest impact because Chrome has about 65% of the impressions, of the market share. And so the biggest impact will be once Chrome gets rid of third-party cookies. I think the biggest thing and where the opportunity lies for marketers, though, is this consumer focus on personalization and privacy. So you can see as Apple introduces these privacy changes and they're not necessarily for iOS 14 in response to any specific privacy regulation or legal requirement. It's something they're doing for their users. And as a marketer, they're using what they've done on the privacy side and with their privacy program really adds a branding opportunity and messaging opportunity. So Apple is really saying you have more personalization, more privacy with iOS 14. And they're really responding to this shift in the landscape where the biggest opportunity is for brands and for marketers today. So first of all, of course, we have existing upcoming legislation. What's really interesting to keep in mind is that Gartner has estimated that 10% of the world's population was covered under what they determined a modern privacy regulation. And that number is supposed to jump to 65% of the world's population just in the next 3 years. So when we think about the more awareness our users and our customers will have about their privacy if laws pass in their location, and the things that we'll need to keep in mind when it comes to serving all of these different audiences with growing privacy regulations, it's something that we'll need to be on top of as marketers. And then there are the changes in the ecosystem. So we looked at changes with iOS 14 and third-party cookies specifically. A big chunk of marketers are viewing the end of third-party cookies as significant or very significant. I think there's still a gap in knowledge for marketers. I know myself, I've relied on different agencies or using a vendor to kind of manage ads, ad placement, the ad inventory, and the ad tech ecosystem. So I think just 36% of marketers stated that they had a good understanding of the third-party cookie crackdown or deprecation. A lot of them say it's really significant, but about half report that they don't have a good understanding or don't know enough about the third-party cookies going away. So definitely an opportunity to, with a full understanding, kind of set yourself apart as a marketer. And finally, we have a huge audience focus on privacy and a big opportunity to deliver for our audience, to earn that trust, to make sure we're being as transparent as possible, not only doing what we have to do as marketers to be compliant, but what we should do for our audience when it comes to protecting their privacy. So really what I think the big opportunity is for marketers is making sure that privacy is a key part of any of your customer-centric strategies and initiatives. So campaign planning, email nurture, anytime you're collecting data or engaging with your customers, make sure that you have privacy as something on your list to address for your audience. Next, you need to make sure that you are educating your customers, making sure that you're being transparent about not only your privacy policies, but about what they can expect when they share information with you. I think that this goes hand in hand with making sure that you're using clear, concise language that's easily understood and consistent with your brand voice. This is why I talk a lot about marketers making sure that they are aligned and know their privacy team, their legal team very well, so that they can they can collaborate on things on their website when it comes to policy and notice. So it's not a big legal document that, yes, might check that compliance box, but really means nothing to our audience. We want to make sure that we as marketers have influence over that to bring a great user experience, a transparent user experience to our audience. Next, I encourage marketers to look at building a location on their website, either a privacy center, a preference center, a trust portal, whatever you end up calling it, but a destination that's going to be available for your audience, for your users that are seeking out information about how you're protecting their data, about your data collection policies, maybe even about proactively the data that you do have about them, what's on their customer profile, what are you using that for, how are you leveraging that data to personalize the experience. You want to have that there because a lot of customers want to trust brands, work with brands that they trust, that they believe are good stewards of their data, but aren't exactly sure which brands are good stewards of data or which brands they should trust. And there's just not enough information out there for our customers. So making sure that we, as marketers, are not only providing that information so that our customers can find it and we're being transparent, but I see this as a huge opportunity for marketers to differentiate themselves, differentiate the brand, set themselves apart with this information, because there are things that you are doing, I'm sure, as an organization to be compliant with privacy regulations that customers today or your audience today, one, doesn't know about, and two, doesn't know maybe why they should appreciate that. So using the opportunity to educate your audience, as well as kind of tout your brand and what you're doing to go above and beyond to deliver privacy, to deliver personalization to your audience, is really important. I think the biggest takeaway I have for marketers when it comes to looking at privacy, consent, and personalization. Next, what I think goes along with any kind of consent management strategy or what you're looking to do as a compliance factor is really empowering your customers with more choice. So not only when it comes to their opt-ins and opt-outs, but also when you think about maybe the different topics that you have, that you run campaigns on, what kind of frequency of emails, for example, that your users can choose from or opt into. Maybe if they only want to hear about sales or promotions. This is going to differ a lot between B2B and B2C and obviously your industry. But making sure that you're not only giving your customers the opportunity to opt in, opt out, consent or withdrawal consent, but more choices when it comes to their data, kind of above and beyond privacy regulations. So we look at exactly how to get started with this. You obviously have things like the GDPR, the CCPA that you need to comply with. But when we think about exactly what this means and what this might look like at a very high level, you consider a user journey. Maybe when a customer comes to your website, they might opt in, consent, agree to tracking cookies. Then they might subscribe to email, again, consenting, but maybe also selecting some topics of interest as a way to go above and beyond that compliance factor. If they come to your store and maybe you are using your application, maybe they consent to location tracking within that app so that you know when they are in your store. If they purchase an app, maybe that's a point of sale and a time when they'll opt into SMS or text message updates. There's also this idea of if they ever want to opt out or unsubscribe from certain communications, that you can give them the option to opt down. So scale down the number of emails they get from you or the frequency, or maybe eliminate a certain topic or type of content that they're not interested in without totally unsubscribing. So really giving your audience the chance to kind of segment themselves. It's not a binary in or out decision when it comes to things like your email marketing. And finally, things like signing up for maybe a loyalty program, maybe sharing their birthday. All of this data and all of this consent and the preferences that you get along the way really should help you build profiles around the different choices and the preferences that your users are making. So making sure that you are, of course, are addressing regulated consent. So under the GDPR, the CCPA, the CPRA, CASL, TCPA. I can't even count how many acronyms there are for different privacy regulations and data regulations to follow. But first, of course, making sure that you're doing what you have to when it comes to consent, the consent requirements under different privacy regulations. But then getting a little bit more strategic into making sure you're able to personalize and build trust with your audience. So giving the option to choose between different types of content, different topics that your audience wants to hear about. Maybe a frequency. So is it a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly newsletter, a weekly product update, or monthly product update? What kind of choices can you give to your users when it comes to the marketing activities that you have? And finally, making sure, and again, this kind of goes back to consent and what we looked at, making sure it's unbundled, making sure you're separating out SMS versus phone call versus email versus actual mail where appropriate and where needed, so that you have that unbundled granular consent. And where that granular consent is maybe not required, if the GDPR doesn't apply in a certain case, it's so nice to have a transparent user experience, to empower your user to understand them a little bit more. And finally, when you have these transparency in your process, when you're promoting what you're doing with your privacy program in an effective way, your users are going to trust you more and be more willing to share data with you, to realize values like a personalized experience from your brand. So collecting and having a mechanism to collect that demographic, yes, but also behavioral data on intentions, preferences, buying intentions, things like that. And of course, this will vary a lot, again, between B2B and B2C, as well as industry. But kind of having a way to ask those questions that you've always wanted to know as a marketer about your audience is key. And so that is really our approach at OneTrust Preference Choice, is being the bridge between privacy teams and marketing teams within an organization. And of course, with that, kind of bridging the gap between privacy and personalization for our audience. So with our tools for privacy compliance, making sure that we're getting the right consent, we have mechanisms to capture opt-in, opt-outs, double opt-ins, policy and notice terms and conditions, making sure all of those have-tos under privacy regulations are met, captured, done in a way that if you ever have an audit, you're protected as a marketer. And then making sure that you are also have the tools to leverage that investment in compliance and in a privacy program to enhance the user experience and make things more transparent, make sure that you're protecting your data sources and still able to deliver personalized experiences, even with things like third-party cookies and some of the tracking capabilities going away, making sure that you're still able and have a mechanism to personalize experiences, build upon those profiles. You start with the basics of consent, of opt-ins, and really build those out strategically so that you have that proprietary data set. You're really knowing your customers, replacing some of those third-party data sources that are outside of your control, that are going away. So as I mentioned, OneTrust is the most widely used solution for privacy management. And as our privacy programs really evolve, mature, as there are more regulations, there's a lot of overlap between different areas of the business. So I like to say you can't build trust in silos. As a marketer, this is especially important for your organization. to make sure that you can take everything that you're doing internally and what you're investing in within an organization, within your brand, and communicate that as much as possible to your audience to really differentiate your brand. So we help our customers make trust a competitive advantage, a brand differentiator. But first, you have to know your data, know your laws, and we can help automate that with AI, robotic information. Even the smallest organizations, brands, companies now have a lot of data and a lot of laws that will apply to that data. So having a tool that helps you work through that, automate that, understand that is key, as well as having a tool set for different areas of your business, everywhere from third-party risk to procurement teams, selecting the vendors that you work with, obviously governing data within your organization. And as we talked about today, OneTrust Preference Choice, the tool set for marketers, really focused on not only transparency, but bridging that gap between privacy and personalization, as well as being transparent with your messaging and the information that you're proactively sharing with your audience about their privacy and how you're protecting their data. So if you have any more questions, we have some great resources for especially geared towards marketers on preferencechoice.com, including that report I mentioned, looking at the different stakeholders and meeting their needs when it comes to privacy and consent management. We also offer custom demos, free trials, and encourage you to find us on LinkedIn. You can connect with me there as well. A great community for marketers with a lot of marketing resources. Here's my contact information. I would love to hear from you and look at how you're leveraging your privacy program, how you're being transparent with your audience, what your strategies are for continuing to earn trust from your audience going forward, and how involved your marketing team is with those efforts. So I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn, or my contact information is here. I think we have a few more minutes where we can take any questions that have come in. So again, thank you for joining the session. And there's a question box on your screen, and we will take questions now. All right, so some good questions in here. Do the same rules apply for B2C and B2B? Usually, yes. There are more nuances in and kind of evolving definitions of things like what is a consumer, what is a data subject in different regulations. And one thing to note with the GDPR is that the countries of the EU will have their own guidance, and some things in the GDPR are left up to member states to define. So things like what is the age of a minor, how is that defined? Those types of things are often left to the states, the member states. So make sure you have a full understanding of that and what really applies in your organization, depending on your industry. If you're B2B versus B2C, make sure you work with your privacy or legal team to understand that. Let's see. In a form, we ask for consent before downloading a document. Do we in all cases need to allow the download even if they didn't tick the box? Or can we say, if you didn't click, you don't get access to the document? That's a great question. So there's always going to be certain maybe fields that are required to access a document, certain consents that are required for lead generation on your website. Without knowing your location or what customers you're serving, I'm not sure if the GDPR applies, the CCPA applies in this case. So it would be good to have the nuance there. Assuming that you are under the GDPR, for some things like a demo, for example, you can assume consent for that. And there's some nuances with different kind of data types there. So make sure, again, that you're working with your legal team on that. Lots of other questions. Does the consent part need to be separated from the privacy policy too? Yes, so that's what we talked about with unbundled granular, making sure that your customers aren't just agreeing to a long privacy policy that you have published, but making sure that they're actually consenting to that specific data collection for that specific purpose when you're collecting it. And there's one more question about, will it be possible to get a copy of this presentation? Yes, and there should be a PDF available to you that you can download as part of this. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for all the great questions. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them. But check out our preferencechoice.com and our blog there. We often take these questions and turn them into blog posts when we run out of time. So thank you again, everyone, for joining.